When I first met Daniel, he seemed like the perfect roommate. We were both looking to split the rent, and he came across as polite, titty, and easygoing. We moved into a cozy apartment together, and for a while everything felt great. He cooked dinner occasionally, helped with chores, and we enjoyed movie nights and casual conversations about our days. Daniel worked at a quaint bookstore downtown, while I had a job at a local coffee shop. Our lives were pleasantly routine until everything changed. Over time, Daniel became increasingly secretive. He started staying out late, returning home with an unsettling, vacant look in his eyes. Whenever I asked where he'd been, he'd brush it off with vague excuses about hanging out with friends. Something felt off. I'd overhear him on the phone, speaking in a calm yet eerie tone, saying things like, "They can't find out. It's too risky." One night, I came home late from work to find the apartment dark except for a faint light spilling from Daniel's room. I heard what sounded like someone crying, knocking on his door. I called out, "Daniel, are you okay, buddy?" The crying abruptly stopped, and after a tense silence, he responded saying, "Yeah, I'm just a little tired, I'm gonna go to bed now." The next morning he seemed back to his usual self, but my unease only grew. I began noticing oddities. Daniel's clothes sometimes had mysterious stains, which he'd quickly hide, and I discovered a small knife with dried blood in the bathroom cabinet. I confronted him, but Daniel casually laughed it off, claiming it was from a cooking mishap. Weeks passed, and the sense of dread became almost unbearable. I started avoiding him, spending more time at work or with friends, but the fear lingered whenever I was home. One evening, while Daniel was out, I decided to investigate a little. I felt guilty invading his privacy, but I needed answers. I rummaged through his room and found a hidden box in his closet, buried under some clothes. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing a chilling collection of newspaper clippings about unsolved murders in our city. Each article was marked with Daniel's notes, detailing the crimes, including photos of victims and personal items. I was overwhelmed with horror and disgust as I put everything back and fled the apartment. I ended up at a nearby park, trying to steady my nerves. After gathering my courage, I called the police and reported everything. When they arrived, I showed them the box, and they took it very seriously. They began investigating Daniel, and I stayed with a friend, terrified to return to the apartment. Days later, the police called with shocking news. Daniel had been arrested. He was caught trying to dispose of belongings from another victim, and evidence linked him to multiple murders. The revelation left me with a chilling mix of relief and terror. The person I had shared my life with was a cold-blooded killer. Returning to the apartment to pack my things was an eerie experience. The place felt different, almost sinister. Every shadow seemed to hide a secret, every corner a lurking danger. I couldn't believe I had been living with a murderer, oblivious to the signs. As I packed, I discovered a note from Daniel, saying, "I'm sorry you found out this way. I never wanted to hurt you. You were the only real friend I had. Goodbye." That night, I left the apartment for good, moving to a new city to escape the nightmare. Despite my efforts to start fresh, the memories haunted me. I constantly questioned how I had missed the signs, and how many lives might have been spared if I had acted sooner. Living with Daniel changed me forever. I became hyper-aware and wary of those around me, never letting anyone get too close. The fear and mistrust lingered, a haunting reminder of the dark secret I had lived with, the secret of my roommate, the murderer. Driving down an isolated highway one night, I felt like I was in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched out before me, an endless dark ribbon under the faint glow of the moon and my headlights. It was late and exhaustion was setting in. The radio had long since lost its signal, leaving me alone with the engine's monotonous hum and my racing thoughts. As I drove, I noticed the gas gauge dipping dangerously low. I'd hoped to make it to the next town, but now, with the needle hovering just above empty and no gas stations in sight, I was filled with dread. Suddenly the engine sputtered and coughed before giving out completely. I coasted to a stop, my heart sinking. I tried cranking the ignition, but it was futile. The car was out of gas, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my phone, only to find there was no signal. I was utterly cut off. The road was deserted, surrounded by nothing but dense trees and oppressive darkness. Reluctantly, I locked the car and decided to wait inside. I felt safer to stay put rather than venture into the pitch-black wilderness. Time dragged on slowly as I checked my phone repeatedly, but the signal never returned. The silence outside was eerie, occasionally broken by the rustling of leaves in the wind. My nerves were frayed, and I was on edge. Then, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure was emerging from the woods, and my heart raced with fear. As the figure approached, I saw that it was a tall, thin man with wild hair and a scruffy beard. Someone who looked like he'd been living rough. He came up to my car and stopped by the driver's side window, peering in with frantic, unkempt eyes. Then, he began knocking on the window. At first, it was gentle, then with increasing force. The sound was jarring in the still night. Then all of a sudden he started saying, "Hey, let me in. I need help." I swear, his voice was so muffled through the glass. Panic surged through me, as there was no way I was letting this stranger into my car. I shook my head and gripped the steering wheel tightly. The man's knocking grew louder, more desperate. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. What did he want? And why was he out here at this hour? Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, headlights appeared in the distance. A car was approaching, and I felt a surge of relief. I honked the horn, desperately trying to catch the driver's attention. The car slowed and came to a stop behind me. It was a police car. 2 officers emerged, their flashlights slicing through the darkness as they approached. The man from the woods stepped back, his anxiety palpable. "Is everything all right here?" one of the officers asked, shining his flashlight into my car. I quickly unlocked the door and explained, my voice trembling. I said my car ran out of gas, and this man came out of the woods and started knocking on my window. I didn't know what he wants. The officers turned to the man, who was now standing a few feet away, looking increasingly agitated. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" one of them asked. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and disappeared back into the woods, melting into the darkness. The officers watched him go, then turned back to me. "You're lucky we came by," one said. "It's not safe to be out here all alone at night. We'll call a tow truck and give you a ride to the nearest town." Grateful and shaken, I climbed into the back of the police car. As we drove away, I glanced at the woods, where the man had vanished. An unsettling feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the thought that I had narrowly escaped a potentially terrifying situation. The night on a dark highway was a stark reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control and how crucial it is to be prepared. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, wondering what might have happened if the police hadn't arrived when they did. Just after I turned 30, I was in desperate need of a new place to live. I came across a room for rent in a 3-bedroom house, and the landlord, Mr. Thompson, seemed unusually eager to get me in without doing any background checks. It struck me as odd, but the rent was affordable, and I needed somewhere to stay quickly, so I brushed off my concerns and moved in. The house was old, but had a certain charm. It had 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a cozy living room, and a bathroom I had to share with my only roommate, Elizabeth. She worked nights and slept during the day, which meant our paths rarely crossed. In fact, despite living there for over a month, I had never actually met her. Her privacy was strikingly intense, and I found it increasingly strange. Soon after moving in, unsettling occurrences began. My belongings seemed to mysteriously shift. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter only to find them on the dining table, and my toothbrush would be damp even though I hadn't used it. At first I thought I was just being forgetful, but as time went on, the discomfort grew more eerie. One evening, I came home from work to find the front door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it that morning. My heart raced as I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello, is anyone here?" The house seemed eerily still, everything in its place, but the feeling of intrusion was palpable. I meticulously checked all the windows and doors, ensuring they were securely locked. As the nights went on, the house grew more unsettling. I would hear footsteps above me, even though Elizabeth should have been at work. One night a haunting faint humming drifted down from the upper floor, like someone softly was singing a lullaby. It literally sent chills down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house settling, or perhaps my imagination was running wild. But the dread was absolutely relentless. Each creak of the floorboards and each unexplained noise heightened my paranoia, and I began to question, what or who might be lurking in the shadows of that unsettling house. The turning point came one fateful Friday night when I decided to unwind by watching TV in the living room. As I settled in for a late-night show, a chilling sensation of being watched crept over me. I glanced around but saw nothing. Trying to dismiss the eerie feeling, I focused on the TV. Then, with a sudden flicker, the living room light went out. My heart raced. The only illumination came from the TV's dim glow. I turned around slowly, only to see a shadow figure standing in the hallway. Elizabeth. She lingered for a moment before turning and walking away in silence. Elizabeth! I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no answer. My anxiety spiked. I quickly switched the light back on and retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, sleep eluded me, as I couldn't shake the image of Elizabeth standing in the darkness, watching me. The next morning, overwhelmed by fear, I packed a small bag and sought refuge in a nearby motel. I needed to clear my head. I called Mr. Thompson and recounted the strange occurrences. His concern was evident, but his help was minimal. At the motel, I finally managed to get a restful night's sleep. Returning to the house the following day to retrieve my belongings, I noticed something unsettling. The house felt unnervingly quiet. As I packed, I passed Elizabeth's door, which was slightly ajar. Driven by curiosity, I pushed it open and peeked inside. The room was shrouded in darkness, revealing only a small bed, a dresser, and a collection of old photographs. The room seemed untouched for years. One photo in particular caught my eye. A younger Mr. Thompson standing beside a woman who looked exactly like Elizabeth. The date on the back read 20 years. A shiver ran down my spine. How in hell could Elizabeth look the same now as she did in the photo? I heard a creak behind me and spun around, but no one was there. Clutching the photo, I fled the house, my mind racing. I went straight to Mr. Thompson's office and showed him the photo. He turned pale and confirmed that Elizabeth was his sister, who had mysteriously disappeared 20 years ago. He had kept her room exactly as it was, hoping she would one day return. The woman I had been living with was not his sister, but something else entirely, stricken with a mix of fear and sorrow. I realized I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I moved out that very day and found a new place to live. I never returned to the old house. Sometimes, late at night, I still ponder who or what Elizabeth really was. Some mysteries I learned are better left unsolved. It was a dark, moonless night as I drove home with my 2 young children in the back seat. They had been bickering nonstop, and I was at my breaking point. I decided to pull over to the side of the road to calm them down and try to defuse the situation. Turning on the car's hazard lights, I stepped out and opened the back door, trying to reason with them. Just as I was talking to my kids, a car pulled up beside us. A middle-aged couple greeted me with friendly smiles. The man leaned out and said, "Hey there, are you okay?" I reassured them that we were fine, but needed to calm the kids down. The woman in the passenger seat nodded sympathetically and added, "We wanted to let you know there has been an accident just over the next hill. Traffic is backed up, and it might help you if you take the side road a little ways back. It'll get you around the Rickon home faster." I thanked them for the advice, and they waved as they drove off. I got back into my car, still mulling over their suggestion. The thought of navigating an unfamiliar side road in the dark unsettled me, so I decided to stick to the main road, even if it meant getting stuck in traffic. As I drove past the detour road, they mentioned something caught my eye. The couple's car was parked there, and they were standing outside, staring into the dense dark woods. Their stillness was eerie, and a chill ran down my spine. I brushed off the unsettling feeling and continued driving. Maybe they had car trouble or simply stopped for a break. When I reached the top of the hill, I was relieved to find no wreck, no traffic jam, just an empty road stretching ahead. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, and my kids had finally quietened down. But that strange encounter with the couple lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. The next morning, I had to drive down the same road again for some errands. As I approached the detour road, my heart raced with a mix of curiosity and dread. I slowed down, and as I neared the spot where the couple had been, I saw a large sign that read, "Dead End." My mind raced with disturbing thoughts. Why had they suggested a road that led to nowhere? Why had they been standing there in the dark? The sight of the dead-end sign, coupled with their mysterious behavior, left me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. Years have passed since that night, but the memory still haunts me. Whenever I drive past that detour road, a shiver runs down my spine, and I wonder what would have happened if I followed their advice. I mean, would I have found myself lost in the middle of nowhere or worse? The chilling image of the couple standing by their car, surrounded by darkness, continues to give me nightmares. Even now, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I sometimes think I see their car out of the corner of my eye. Always in the same spot, just past the hill before the dead-end sign. But when I look directly, there is nothing there. It's as if they're still waiting, lurking just beyond sight. I don't know who they were or what their intentions were, but I'm grateful I didn't take their detour. It's a haunting reminder that not everything is as it seems. Trust your instincts, especially on lonely country roads. Sometimes the long way home is the safest path. It was a late Friday night when I finally left the office. The clock on my dashboard showed it was nearly midnight. After a grueling week of long hours, I was utterly exhausted. The usual city route home was always busy, even at this hour, so I decided to take a more rural path. It was longer, but much quieter, and I hoped the serene drive would help me unwind. I turned onto the narrow countryside. The full moon bathed everything in silver, and the stars glittered brightly in the night sky. The road was deserted, and all I could hear was the soothing hum of my car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt peaceful, just me and the open road. But soon, an unsettling feeling crept in. The night seemed to grow darker, and the air became much colder. After a few miles, I saw the old bridge up ahead. I had crossed it before, but always during the day. At night, it looked different, more menacing. The bridge was made of creaky woods and iron, a relic from a time long before I was born. As I approached, I noticed a strange, eerie red fog rolling in. It was thick and seemed to glow faintly, casting a ghostly hue over the bridge. A shiver ran down my spine and my heart began to race. Something about the fog felt wrong, but I tried to dismiss it as fatigue-induced paranoia, I drove onto the bridge, the wooden planks groaning beneath my car. The fog thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in front of me. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I pressed the gas pedal, eager to get across as quickly as possible. The air felt dense and suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Finally, I reached the other side and let out a sigh of relief. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. Standing in the middle of the bridge was a figure, a woman in a white dress, her long hair cascading down. She was staring directly at my car. My heart pounded in my chest, and I dared not to stop or turn back. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. The figure remained, motionless in the red fog, her gaze fixed on me as I sped away. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, my heart still racing. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory. Over breakfast, I mentioned the incident to my parents. Their faces went pale, and my dad's expression grew serious. Then my dad all of a sudden asked me, "You saw her, didn't you?" I said, "Who?" as my voice was trembling. Then my dad said, "The girl on the bridge. There's an old story about that bridge. A young lady hung herself from it many years ago. They say her spirit still haunts the place." A chill ran down my spine, and then I asked, "What happened to her?" My dad said no one knows for sure, but some say she was waiting for a lover who never arrived. Others think she was fleeing from something or someone, but everyone agrees on one thing: she died on that bridge, and her spirit never left. I sat there, my breakfast untouched. The figure in the fog made sense now, but it only deepened the sense of dread. I had seen a ghost, the ghost of a woman who had taken her own life. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze. I couldn't stop thinking about the bridge and the ghostly figure. Sunday night, I barely slept, dreading the drive to work the next morning. For weeks, I avoided the rural road and the bridge, but the memory lingered haunting my dreams. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. One evening, I decided to investigate further. I searched the bridge and discovered old newspaper articles and local legends. The young lady's name was Emily. She had gone to the bridge to meet her lover, who never showed up. Heartbroken, she had hung herself from the iron railings. Reports of her ghost, complete with the red frock and white dress, matched my experience exactly. The story only intensified my unease. I felt a deep sorrow for Emily, trapped in her endless grief. I wondered if there was anything I could do to help her find peace. A month after my initial encounter, I found myself on the rural road again, driven by a mix of dread and resolve. As I neared the bridge, my heartbeat quickened, and that unfamiliar chill settled over me. The red fog was back, thick and glowing. I drove onto the bridge, and there she was, just as before, standing in the middle, her presence palpable. I stopped the car and rolled down the window, whispering, "I'm sorry," unsure if she could hear me. I said, "I hope you find peace." Then for a moment, the figure stood still. Then she began to fade slowly. The red fog lifted, and she vanished completely, leaving only the quiet of the night behind. I drove home with a newfound sense of calm, hoping that somehow Emily had found some measure of peace. I never saw her again, but the memory of that night and the old bridge stayed with me forever. I'd always been captivated by the idea of camping alone in the forest. The thought of escaping the city's chaos and immersing myself in nature thrilled me. So one Friday afternoon, I packed my tent, sleeping bag, and some supplies, and drove to the edge of the dark forest. I parked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and began the hike deep into the woods. The sun was still shining brightly when I reached a small clearing. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. The trees stood tall and dense, their leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze, and the chirping of birds added a soothing soundtrack to the scene. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and started a small campfire as the sun began its descent. As twilight fell, the forest transformed into a shadowy labyrinth. The only sounds were the crackling of my fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Wrapped in my sleeping bag, I gazed up at the star-filled sky, feeling both exhilarated and alone. Suddenly a rustle in the nearby bushes jolted me upright. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just an animal, but the noise persisted, growing louder and closer. I strained my eyes into the darkness beyond the flickering firelight, calling out, "Who's there?" My voice trembled in the eerie silence. There was no response. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the bushes, but the beam only revealed swaying leaves and branches. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or a raccoon. Still, a sense of unease clung to me, like a cold shroud. I added more wood to the fire, hoping it would keep any curious creatures at bay. Every snap of twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. Hours passed, and I finally began to feel drowsy. Just as I was about to retreat into my tent, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate crunches on the fallen leaves. My blood ran cold. This was no animal. Someone was approaching my camp. "Who's there?" I shouted again, my voice echoing through the silent forest. Still, there was no reply at all. I grabbed a large stick from the ground and stood by the fire, my eyes darting through the darkness. Then I saw him, a tall figure emerging from the shadows. Just beyond the reach of the firelight, he stood still, staring directly at me. Though I couldn't make out his features, I felt his eyes boring into me. Then I said to him, "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't answer. He just continued to watch. Panic surged through me. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I had to get away. I backed slowly towards my tent, my mind racing. And without any warnings, the man started moving towards me, his steps quick and purposeful. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted into the forest, my heart pounding. The darkness enveloped me, disorienting me, but I dared not stop. Branches clawed at my arms and face as I crashed through the underbrush, driven by sheer terror. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps growing louder and closer. I stumbled over a root and crashed to the ground, pain shooting through my ankle. Ignoring the agony, I scrambled to my feet, Limping as fast as I could, the faint glow of moonlight through the trees guided me, offering a sliver of hope. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into another clearing and saw a small cabin with lights glowing warmly inside. I limped towards the cabin, banging on the door, my voice cracking with desperation. "Help! Please help me!" Tears streamed down my face. The door opened, and an old man stood there, his face itched with concern. I asked, "What is going on?" while my eyes were absolutely wide. "There is someone after me," I cried, glancing over my shoulder. The man stepped aside and rushed inside, collapsing onto the floor. He quickly shut and locked the door, peering out the window. "There is no one there," he said, turning back to me. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded, still trembling. He was chasing me. The old man nodded slowly and handed me a blanket. "You can stay here tonight. We'll sort this out in the morning." I thanked him, my voice barely a whisper as I wrapped myself in the blanket on the couch. The sense of safety was a balm, though exhaustion soon pulled me into a fitful sleep. The old man remained nearby, keeping a vigilant watch on the door. When morning arrived, the old man and I ventured back to my campsite. There was no sign of the stranger, but the terror of that night clung to me. I packed up my things and left the forest, vowing never to camp alone again. The peaceful solitude I had once longed for had turned into a nightmarish ordeal I would never forget. Last summer, I set out for a hunting trip in the familiar woods near my hometown in Oregon, a place that had always felt like my sanctuary. Every weekend, I would head out with my rifle, seeking the tranquil escape that only nature could provide. But one summer morning, everything took a terrifying turn. I ventured into the forest just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The woods were alive, with the usual symphony of chirping birds and rustling leaves, promising a perfect day for hunting. But as I moved deeper into the forest, something strange happened. The sound of nature abruptly ceased, leaving behind an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Ignoring the creeping sense of dread, I pressed on, but the fog began to thicken around me, swallowing up the forest. Visibility dwindled to mere feet, and panic started to gnaw at me. Despite my experience, this oppressive fog was unsettling. Then, through the murkiness, I spotted something that made my heart race. A dilapidated cabin appearing like a relic from a horror movie. With trepidation, I approached the cabin, my footsteps muffled by the thick fog. I knocked on the door, but the silence that answered was heavy and unnerving. I pushed the door open and peered inside. The interior was dim and dusty, untouched for years, except for one chilling detail. A hunting rifle identical to mine, propped against the wall. A wave of fear surged through me. Whose rifle was that? And where exactly its owner? I stumbled back into the fog, my mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. No matter which direction I took, the force seemed to conspire against me, leading me in circles. Hours dragged on, and exhaustion set in. Just when I felt I couldn't go any further, I spotted a figure in the distance, a man standing in a clearing. Relief surged through me as I staggered toward him. "Please, help me, I'm lost," I called out to him as my voice was trembling. But as I got closer, the man's face twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes hollow and devoid of life. Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands clawing at my throat. I fought back with all my strength, but it felt like I was battling a demon. Despair nearly overwhelmed me when I heard a voice calling my name through the haze of fear. A figure emerged from the fog, a woman with a rifle slung over her shoulder. With a swift, practiced motion, she raised the rifle and fired. The shot rang out with a thunderous crack, and the man's grip on me loosened. Staggering back in shock, he let out a final, anguished scream before vanishing into the mist, leaving behind a bloody trail. Then, the woman helped me to get on my feet. Her eyes were filled with concern, saying, "Are you okay?" Asking gently. Still shaken, I whispered, "Thank you for saving my life." Her smile was warm, but tinged with sadness. "You're not the first hunter to stumble into these woods," she said, "and unless we do something, we won't be the last." Together, we made our way out of the forest, the fog gradually lifting as we neared the edge. The setting sun bathed us in its warm glow. But even as we left the woods behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and sinister still lurked within. The cabin remained a haunting reminder that as long as it stood, no one would ever truly be safe in those woods again. In September, I embarked on a solo hunting trip in the vast wilderness of Wyoming. Eager to bag an antelope, the landscape was awe-inspiring, with rolling hills and endless sagebrush stretching as far as the eye could see. After months of preparation, I was finally here, surrounded by nature's grandeur. As I trekked through the terrain, my senses were sharp, scanning for any signs of my prey. The sun blazed overhead, casting a golden hue over the land. I had been hiking for hours, my canteen nearly empty, but my determination drove me forward. Then, in the distance, I spotted it, a magnificent antelope, its coat shimmering in the sunlight. I raised my rifle, took aim, and fired. The animal dropped and a rush of excitement surged through me. I had succeeded, but as I approached my prize, something strange caught my eye. A blindingly bright light, moving at an incredible speed, darted across the horizon. At first, I thought it might be a game warden's vehicle, but as the light drew closer, I realized it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It streaked into the sagebrush and vanished from sight. Perplexed and uneasy, I scanned the area but saw nothing. No vehicles, no people, just a vast emptiness of the wilderness. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized I was utterly alone, with no phone signal to call for help. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, tagging the antelope and field dressing it with practiced efficiency. Yet, my mind kept drifting back to that eerie light. What was it? Where had it come from? And where had it gone? I just kept asking myself these questions, As I finished my work and looked up, my heart skipped a beat. The light had reappeared, speeding away from me with a fluid grace that defied explanation. I watched in stunned silence as it vanished into the distance, leaving me with a deep sense of unease. I felt as though I was being watched, and the oppressive silence of the wilderness amplified my fear. I hastily gathered my gear and began the trek back to my truck. My senses heightened and my pulse racing. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if unseen eyes were boring into me. I spun around, but the forest remained empty, shrouded in silence. I knew I had to get out of there quickly. Reaching my truck, I threw my gear into the back and leaped into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, relief washed over me. I was safe, at least for now. But as I drove away from the wilderness, a gnawing sensation remained. It felt like something had been left behind, lurking in the shadows, waiting. The memory of that mysterious light haunted me, and I know I'd never forget the terror I felt in those desolate hills. From that day forward, I never hunted alone again, always ensuring that I had a companion by my side. And whenever I gazed up at the night sky, I couldn't shake the eerie thought, was that light out there hurtling through the darkness searching for its next unwitting victim or no? When I was 14 years old, my family and I went camping at a state park, and my friend and I were buzzing with excitement. We envisioned days of exploring the woods and nights spent swamping spooky stories and around the campfire. Little did we know, our adventure would soon take a chilling turn. After setting up our tents, my friend and I decided to embark on one of our 4 favorite activities, a night walk through the woods. We called it the walk, and it usually involved navigating the darkened forest with just our flashlights. This night, however, we ventured farther than usual. The trees seemed to stretch higher, and the shadows grew more menacing. Strange noises, twigs snapping and leaves rustling, drifted through the air, but we dismissed them as normal forest sounds. Suddenly we began to hear whispering. It was faint at first, but it grew much louder and more insistent over the time, coming from all directions. We swung our flashlights around, searching for the source, but saw nothing. Despite our growing unease, we pressed on. The whispering escalated, becoming more urgent. Then, out of the darkness, we saw her. A woman crawling on the first floor, her dark clothes merged with the shadows, and she whispered incoherently. Her voice was a disturbing murmur that barely reached our ears. We froze. Our flashlights trained on her as she looked up. Her eyes locked onto ours, and she struggled to her feet, mumbling, saying, "I'm looking for my campsite." Her slurred speech and erratic behavior unsettled us, but we decided to help her find her way back. As we guided her through the woods, She stumbled and swayed, her words barely coherent. When we finally reached her campsite, her friends were no more to be found. They had left her behind without realizing she was missing. We helped her into her tent, feeling a mix of relief and lingering discomfort. The next day, she was at the campfire again, her eyes hollow and her skin unnaturally pale. She barely acknowledged us. Her gaze fixed on something far away. We tried to avoid her, but she seemed to appear everywhere, always lurking at the edge of our vision. That night, we decided to take another walk, hoping to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over us. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the whispering returned, louder and more urgent. We turned, our flashlight sweeping the darkness, but again, we saw no one there. Then, she emerged from the shadows, her eyes as black as coal and her skin a ghostly gray. Her whispering grew louder and more menacing. We tried to flee, but her foot felt like as if they were cemented to the ground. She advanced towards us, her gaze fixed and her whispering a relentless, terrifying chant. Paralyzed with fear, we couldn't move or speak. Everything suddenly went black. When I came to, I was back at our campsite, my friend shaking me awake. His face was etched with worry, saying, "What happened?" in a trembling voice. I responded to him saying, "You just collapsed," as his eyes were filled with concern. Then after that, I immediately said, "We need to get out of here right now." We hurriedly packed our gear and fled the campsite, never looking back. The events of that night were never spoken of again, but the memory of that whispering woman lingered, haunting my dreams and making me wonder about the true nature of the darkness that prowled those woods.